Pripyat, perhaps the most famous abandoned city in the world. To travel to this lost place in the northern wastes of Ukraine is to visit a post-apocalyptic world, a once bustling metropolis allowed to fall into decline following the reactor meltdown of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986. Before the disaster, the city was held by the Soviet Union as the crown jewel of its atomic energy might, but afterwards became an eternal reminder of their terrible folly, and would rumble confidence in the safety of nuclear power across the globe. The region in which Pripyat was built falls into the Kiev Oblast, the nearest city of which was Chernobyl. The first roots of Chernobyl were founded in around 1193, where it was described in a charter as a hunting lodge of Knyaz Rurik Rostilovich in the land of Kievan Rus. From the 16th century, Hasidic Judaism became a prominent part of the region when, during the era of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, nobleman Filon Mita established Jews as tenants in the town of Chernobyl, which was his fiefdom. Despite a series of pogroms undertaken by Cossacks during the late 17th century and early 18th century, by 1765, the Jewish population in Chernobyl had grown to 696 inhabitants, who worked the fields and eked out a life among the flatlands of the Kiev Oblast. In 1795, the Commonwealth era ended with the Second Division of Poland, and Chernobyl became part of the Russian Empire, under the administration of the Radomzyl district of the Kiev province, and by 1900 the Jewish population had risen to 9,351 people. The primary income of Chernobyl's population was through crafting, gardening and farm work, but the town was also a significant centre for trading and fishing due to its strategic location on the Pripyat River, a lengthy watercourse that rises in Lithuania and stretches across the breadth of Ukraine before emptying into the Black Sea, while 3 times a year fairs were held in the town during which Jewish traders from nearby settlements gathered. The peace of the region soon turned sour though, when from October 1905, a series of violent pogroms were undertaken by Cossacks and Gentile peasants against the Jewish population, including beatings, robbery and property destruction. Things became worse when the Ukrainian War of Independence began in November 1917, as, following the withdrawal of Austro-Hungarian troops during the latter stages of World War I, Ukraine attempted to cede from the collapsing Russian Empire after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the October Revolution, the conflict inflamed further by the intervention of Bolshevik supporters. During the war, Chernobyl was captured in 1919 by the gang of Ataman Struk, a group of bandits who, over the course of a month, murdered hundreds of local Jews, primarily by drowning them in the river, while those who survived were forced to pay a significant tribute. To escape the carnage, many Jews in the Kiev Oblast region chose to flee to Western Europe or make the crossing to America, although attempts were made by the Russian Red Cross to provide shelter for displaced or persecuted Jewish families. Eventually, in November 1921, the civil war ended, and what remained of Ukraine was split between the Bolshevik forces led by Vladimir Lenin, which created the wider Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, while individual regions to the north, west and south were divided between Poland, Romania and Czechoslovakia. By 1926, only 39% of the population in Chernobyl was Jewish, amounting to 3,165 people, a loss of over 6,000 people since 1900. Under the rule of the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, the rural regions of Russia and its many vassal states suffered greatly at the hands of his economic policies, attempting to force the Soviet nation from its previous feudal state under the Tsarist government into a 20th century superpower. To achieve this, Stalin drafted a succession of 5-year plans, which demanded rapid industrialization and the collectivization of farms and agriculture, bringing them under state control through the seizing of private assets, while any protest or refusal to comply with this policy by the landowners was answered through summary executions. This mixture of violent collectivization and a lack of suitable equipment to provide for the growing Soviet population led to disruptions in food production that resulted in the famine of 1932 to 1933, which saw between 3.2 and 3.9 million Ukrainians die from starvation. This combination of criminally poor government and a purge of experienced high-ranking officers and party officials due to Stalin's paranoia of being overthrown meant that when Nazi Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler commenced the invasion of the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Red Army were completely unprepared to defend themselves against the advancing enemy. Just over a month after the operation commenced, Nazi forces captured Chernobyl on August 25th and immediately set to work rounding up the remaining Jewish families of the town and either having them executed on the spot or shipped to the death camps of Auschwitz and Belsen as part of what is now known as the Holocaust. After 2 years of occupation, Nazi forces were ousted from Chernobyl briefly by Soviet counterattacks in September 1943, and despite the Germans recapturing the town in October, they were finally pushed back forever on November 17th. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Jewish population, after nearly 400 years of existence in the region, had been whittled down to only a few dozen families, although some Jews who had escaped the advance of the Nazis, or were away fighting with the Red Army, did resettle in Chernobyl. In the end, despite rampant anti-Semitism by the Soviet government, and a ban on practicing the Jewish religion in private homes in 1965, as well as the destruction of the synagogue and confiscation of religious artifacts, by 1979 it was reported that only 150 Jewish families remained in the Chernobyl region. As Russia and Nazi Germany battled fiercely to gain control of Eastern Europe, the United States, with the assistance of German scientists who had escaped the Nazis before the war, developed the ability to take the destructive force from a nuclear reaction to create the first atomic weapons. While the attacks on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the closing weeks of World War II illustrated their ability to obliterate large areas in a matter of seconds, development was also made to harness the power of nuclear fission in order to create an energy alternative, one that wouldn't be limited by the finite nature of coal and oil reserves, while also providing comparatively clean environmental outputs, aside from the handling of nuclear waste. In September 1948, the United States was able to use the power of nuclear energy in a non-destructive manner for the first time with the X-10 graphite reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was used to power a conventional light bulb, before being expanded to a larger experiment in December 1951 with the EBR-1 experimental station near Arco, Idaho. It was during this time that the Cold War between the capitalist United States and the Communist Soviet Union began to leave an ugly mark on a divided world, as the two superpowers went head-to-head in developing the most advanced armies, navies, air forces, and nuclear arsenals on the planet, with any innovations made by the USA being quickly replicated in the USSR. It was in this capacity that the Soviet Union became the first nation to build a nuclear power station in order to generate electricity for a national grid, that being on June 27, 1954, at the Obninsk nuclear power plant near Moscow. Obninsk, however, was a comparatively small-scale development, and its potential energy output was superseded by the power station at Sellafield in England on October 17, 1956. By 1970, 5 nuclear power plants were operational in the USSR, and with the arms and power race between Russia and America reaching its peak, the battle was on to develop more and more plants across the Soviet Union. The location of Chernobyl, as the site for a nuclear power station, was considered by the USSR's Ministry of Energetics due to the low population of the area and easy access to water, with earlier proposals to build a plant 20 miles outside of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev being rejected by the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences due to its proximity to the city. The site, known as Vladimir Ilyich or V.I. Lenin, was to be situated 16 miles north of Chernobyl in an area of largely flat woodland in the Kiev Oblast. To coincide with the construction of the nuclear plant at Chernobyl in 1970, a city was planned to house workers who were to build and operate the plant, this city being named Pripyat, in reference to the nearby river, and was formally established on February 4th of that year. The city of Pripyat was to be a communist utopian metropolis, being a mixture of cheaply built but functional residential blocks, a common feature across the Soviet Union, and an autonomous governing body, including an administrative centre with associated police, fire and hospital services, as well as education in the form of several schools of differing levels. As a brand new city, the Soviet government prided itself on making sure the settlement was to be the pinnacle of Russian design and planning, with department stores, amusement parks, leisure centres, parks, and other amenities available in order to entertain the families of the power plant workers. Due to the nature of their work, rations were also improved in Pripyat over those available in nearby Kiev or Minsk, as people associated with the atomic energy industry were given preferential treatment. Unlike many cities in Soviet Russia, efforts were made to seamlessly combine nature and man through unique planning and design choices, including wide spacious boulevards lined with trees, flowers and grassland. Due to the proximity of the river, white sand was imported from the Black Sea in order to create beaches, and water transport was provided in the form of Rakita hydrofoils built by Krasnoye Samovo, which were the fastest way to get to Kiev using the Pripyat River, capable of completing the 62-mile journey in approximately 2 hours. Another form of transportation for the city, aside from the extensive highway network, was the pre-existing Yaniv railway station on the Chernobyl-Ovruch railway with onward connections to Kiev. Reactor 1 at the Chernobyl power plant would begin operation in 1977, by which time 14,000 people were living in Pripyat, followed by Reactor 2 in 1978, Reactor 3 in 1981, and Reactor 4 in 1983, while 2 further reactors, 5 and 6, were planned but never finished. As for Pripyat itself, by 1986 the population had reached its peak of 49,360 people, and much had been done to make sure this blooming metropolis was to be the flagship of Soviet technological prowess. In the mid-70s, the Policia Hotel was open to house dignitaries and guests visiting the Chernobyl plant, including Western nuclear technicians who were occasionally allowed to view the structure. For entertainment, such leisure venues included the Azure swimming pool, an indoor public swimming pool which opened in the late 1970s, as well as a basketball court being later added as part of a wider leisure centre complex. The Avanhard Stadium opened in 1979 as the home ground for FC Stroitel Pripyat, which played as part of the KFK competition of the Ukrainian SSR, the second level of the Soviet Amateur Football League, and the fifth level of the Soviet Union Football League system. As part of the continued establishment of the communist ideal across the USSR during the 1970s and 80s, the Palace of Culture Energetic, one of 137,000 eventually built by 1988, was opened, these large buildings having been designed as a focal point for people to enjoy a range of recreational and artistic activities, but were mostly used for propaganda purposes to maintain the faith of an increasingly disenchanted population in the ethos of communism. The Pripyat Palace included a cinema, theatre, library, gymnasium, swimming pool, boxing and wrestling ring, dancing and meeting halls, and even had a shooting range in the basement. Perhaps the most notable entertainment venue of Pripyat was the amusement park, which was erected in late April 1986 in order to celebrate the May Day and Victory Day celebrations, a tribute for the triumph of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany in 1945. On April 26, 1986, the crew at the Chernobyl nuclear power station prepared to undertake a routine safety test on RBMK-type reactor number 4. The test was conducted to simulate an electrical power outage, and was done as part of further development on a safety procedure for maintaining cooling and water circulation until the backup generators could provide power. This operating gap was about 1 minute, and had been identified as a potential safety problem that could cause the nuclear reactor core to overheat. The test of April 1986 was the fourth undertaken on Reactor 4 since it commenced operation in 1983, but had been delayed by 10 hours, knocking the operating shift out of balance. At just after 1:20 in the morning, the test began, but the supervisor had failed to follow the correct procedure, creating unstable operating conditions that, combined with inherent RBMK reactor design flaws and the intentional disabling of several nuclear reactor safety systems, resulted in an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. Massive amounts of energy were suddenly released, vaporizing superheated cooling water and rupturing the reactor core in a highly destructive steam explosion, followed immediately by an open-air reactor core fire that released considerable airborne radioactive contamination for about 9 days, that precipitated onto parts of the USSR and Western Europe. The reactor explosion killed 2 of the reactor operating staff, while firemen who had been sent from Pripyat to tackle the blaze were exposed to fatal levels of radiation, resulting in up to 40 deaths related to acute radiation poisoning, 28 in the first days and months, and 14 over the course of several years. By April 27th, it became apparent to Russian nuclear technicians that the exposed reactor core, assisted through the raging inferno, was sending out fatal levels of radioactive particles into the surrounding region, putting the nearby city in immediate danger. As such, the population were ordered to gather what few things they were allowed to carry, and ferried on hundreds of buses out of Pripyat, in an evacuation that lasted 2 days. Suddenly, the nearby city of Chernobyl, as well as other regional centres, were inundated with over 49,000 refugees escaping the radioactive nightmare occurring back in Pripyat. At the plant, fire crews, now donning radiation suits, continued to battle the blaze in the chaotic ruins of reactor number 4, until eventually, on May 4th, the fire was brought under control. However, the exposed reactor core had, in its 9 days of being open to the elements, kicked out enough radioactive material to cause an area of nearly 10 square kilometers to be contaminated beyond safe living conditions, including the city of Pripyat. Therefore, it was quickly determined that this once bustling metropolis would not be suitable for habitation in the foreseeable future, and in the years following the disaster, Pripyat has been left to descend into the rack and ruin it has now gained so much notoriety for. On October 10, 1986, Eric Pozdyshev, the newly appointed director of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, officially announced that a new city was to be built, known as Slavutich, which was constructed between late 1986 and October 1988. The city, sited 40 miles east of the Chernobyl plant, is now home to approximately 25,000 people, many of whom still work as part of the continued monitoring and cleanup of the ruined power station. A tragic consequence of there being so many children born during the time of the disaster, however, is that a significant portion of the city's younger residents are prone to radiation-related illnesses, including prominent instances of cancer. At Chernobyl itself, work on containing the still exposed nuclear core was undertaken by creating a towering concrete sarcophagus over the collapsed roof of the reactor chamber, this being only a temporary fixture until a more permanent solution was considered. The original sarcophagus, despite its projected lifespan of 20 to 30 years, began to deteriorate significantly after only a decade, and therefore between 2010 and 2018, a new containment sarcophagus was moved into position over the previous one, the new shelter being expected to contain the radioactive output of reactor number 4 for the next 100 years. As for Pripyat itself, while the wider city deteriorated quickly under the harsh Ukrainian elements, some areas continue to see use into the 1990s. The Azure Pool, for instance, was used for the decontamination of liquidators sent into the power plant as part of the long-term site cleanup and containment process, with final usage of the pool in this manner being in 1998, after which it was drained and left abandoned like the rest of the crumbling metropolis. Today, Pripyat has become one of the most significant tourist attractions in the world due to its place as an abandoned modern city. Though the site is restricted by a 6.2-mile exclusion zone extending in all directions, access to the city is allowable under certain circumstances, with radiation levels generated by the Chernobyl plant having subsided to a point where short-term occupation is unlikely to cause acute illness, though stays longer than 2 months are cited as risky by the scientific community. Regardless, Pripyat's abandonment has given rise to among the most famous images of a post-apocalyptic world, being noted as a major influence on films, books, and other media regarding the deterioration of a large city. In the once bustling Soviet-era apartment blocks and wide grassy boulevards, everything is still as it was when the 49,000 residents were hastily driven from their homes and ferried away during the frantic evacuation of 1986, though much has been looted by interlopers. Regardless, Pripyat will never be re-inhabited, as cleanup operations at the Chernobyl plant are set to continue until 2065 at the earliest, and even if radiation levels decreased to a point that human habitation of the city was safely possible, all infrastructure that remains standing is far beyond salvage. Perhaps in the future, when it is safe to venture into the exclusion zone on a regular basis, Pripyat will become some kind of living museum, akin to Pompeii, an example of unexpected destruction and a freeze frame in time. Thanks again for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, why not leave a like, and be sure to subscribe for more great content. Thank you very much, take care, and I'll see you next time.